What if I told you that one of history's most infamous monsters, a queen whose name became a curse, a child's scary game, a synonym for butchery, died believing she was a savior? What if the blood-red stain on her legacy was not painted with malice, but with the tears of a broken child, the desperation of a barren wife, and the terrifying certainty of a righteous believer? We call her Bloody Mary, and we picture a tyrant, a woman bathed in the flames of her victims, her face twisted in a cruel sneer. We imagine a monster who delighted in the scent of burning flesh, a fanatic who hunted her own people for sport. This is the caricature history has handed down to us, simple, clean, and monstrously satisfying. It's a tale that fits neatly into our understanding of good versus evil. But history is never clean, and the truth is rarely simple. The story we are told is one of fire and faith. Nearly 300 souls, men and women, learned bishops and humble weavers condemned to the stake. Their bodies turned to ash for the crime of believing in the wrong version of God. We are told this was an act of supreme arrogance, a queen forcing her conscience upon a nation. But what if it wasn't arrogance? What if it was terror? The terror of a woman who had seen her own world collapse because of a theological dispute. The terror of a daughter who was branded a bastard, stripped of her titles, and cast into the shadows, all in the name of a new faith. The terror of a queen who believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was in a cosmic battle for the immortal souls of her people, and that the fires of Smithfield were a terrible but necessary cauterization of a spiritual disease that would otherwise condemn them all to eternal hellfire. Forget the monster for a moment. Forget the nickname. I want you to imagine a different woman, a woman so pious, so deeply and profoundly devout, that she would rather face death than displease God. A woman whose entire life was a testament to suffering and endurance. A woman who, upon finally grasping the crown she believed was her divine right, found herself utterly alone, ruling a divided kingdom, married to a foreign prince who did not love her, and haunted by a womb that would not quicken. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about how monsters are made. It is the story of Mary Tudor, the first Queen of England to rule in her own right, and the tragic, horrifying, and deeply human story of how a princess, once called the Pearl of the World, became Bloody Mary. To understand the fire, you must first understand the fall. Before the schism, before the shame, there was a golden age. Princess Mary, born in 1516, was not just a princess. She was the jewel of the Tudor court, the beloved and only surviving child of the formidable King Henry VIII and the devout Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish sovereigns who had funded Columbus. Mary was the center of their world. She was brilliant, precocious, and adored. She was given a Renaissance education that rivaled any man's, studying Latin, Greek, science, and music. The great scholar Erasmus dedicated works to her. Ambassadors praised her poise and intelligence. She was the undisputed heir to the English throne, betrothed at various times to the Dauphin of France and the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Her future was as bright and secure as the crown she was destined to wear. Her world was one of order, faith, and love. A world where her father was a valiant defender of the faith and her mother was the model of queenly piety. It was perfect, and it was all about to be obliterated. The catalyst for this cataclysm was a simple, primal human desire. King Henry VIII wanted a son. Queen Catherine, after numerous miscarriages and stillbirths, had only given him Mary. As the years passed, Henry's anxiety grew into a consuming obsession. He saw a charismatic, dark-eyed lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, who promised him a son but refused to be his mistress. She would be his queen, or nothing. Henry, a man who bent the world to his will, concocted a religious justification for his lust. He claimed his marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, was cursed in the eyes of God, citing a passage from Leviticus. He needed an annulment from the Pope. But Catherine would not yield. She was his true wife. Their marriage was valid, and their daughter, Mary, was the legitimate heir. The Pope, under the thumb of Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused to grant the annulment. And so, Henry VIII did the unthinkable. He broke 1,000 years of history. He tore England away from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and had his own archbishop grant him the divorce. For the teenage Mary, this was not a political or theological abstraction. It was the complete and violent destruction of her universe. Her beloved father became her tormentor. Her pious mother was cast aside, banished from court, and forbidden from seeing her daughter. The Act of Succession of 1534 was a dagger to Mary's heart. It declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void from the beginning, in a single stroke of a pen. Mary, the Princess of Wales, the heir to the throne, was rendered illegitimate. She was no longer Princess Mary. She was now the Lady Mary, a royal bastard. Her household was dissolved. She was stripped of her jewels, her servants, and her dignity. In a final, exquisitely cruel act of humiliation, she was sent to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her own infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman she saw as the destroyer of her family. Anne Boleyn, Mary, whose faith was the bedrock of her identity, was relentlessly pressured to accept her father's new title and the invalidity of her parents' marriage. To do so would be to call her own mother a harlot and herself a bastard, and to renounce the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth. She refused. For years, she lived in a state of constant fear, isolated, ill, but unbending. Her defiance enraged the king. He threatened her. Her mother wrote her secret letters urging her to stay strong, and Mary clung to her faith and her legitimacy as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. This was the crucible that forged her. It instilled in her a deep-seated trauma, a profound distrust of religious innovation, and an iron will. It taught her that faith was not a matter of comfort, but a battle to be fought, and that compromise was a path to damnation. After Henry's death, her younger half-brother, the boy king Edward VI, took the throne. Raised by Protestant tutors, Edward's reign saw England plunge into a more radical form of Protestantism. Statues were smashed, stained glass windows were broken, and the Latin Mass, which Mary cherished, was outlawed and replaced with a new English prayer book. Mary became the figurehead for the old Catholic resistance. She lived in semi-seclusion on her country estates, openly defying the king's council by having Mass celebrated in her private chapel. They threatened her. They arrested her chaplains. They sent delegations to bully her into submission. But the girl who had defied Henry VIII was now a woman of 33, hardened by years of suffering. She would not break. She saw the new religion as a gray, barren, soulless thing, a heresy that was robbing England of its sacred heritage. She believed her brother was a pawn in the hands of wicked men, and she prayed for the day she could restore the true faith. That day came in 1553. Edward died at the age of 15, and his Protestant council, desperate to prevent the Catholic Mary from taking the throne, attempted a coup. They proclaimed a distant cousin, the hapless Lady Jane Grey, as queen. This was their final, fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated Mary, and they had profoundly misread the English people. For all the religious turmoil, the English people believed in legitimacy and succession. Mary was Henry VIII's daughter, the rightful heir. As she rode towards London, the people flocked to her. The army deserted the council. The navy declared for her. In a matter of days, the coup collapsed. Lady Jane Grey was imprisoned, and Mary rode into London in a wave of popular triumph. Crowds cheered, bells pealed, and for a moment, it seemed her suffering was over. After a lifetime of humiliation, she was Queen of England. She wept with joy, believing it was a divine miracle, a clear sign from God that her destiny was to heal her fractured nation and lead it back to the warm embrace of Rome. Now, everything rested on her shoulders. Her first acts were ones of clemency. She released the Catholic bishops imprisoned under Edward's reign. Initially, she was lenient, hoping that the Protestant heresy would simply wither away once the true faith was restored. But she had two overriding objectives, two pillars upon which her entire vision for England rested. First, she needed to secure the Catholic succession by marrying and producing an heir. She chose Prince Philip of Spain, the son of her old ally, the Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage was deeply unpopular in England. The people feared being ruled by a foreign power. Parliament pleaded with her not to marry him. But Mary, ever stubborn, saw it as her duty. She needed a powerful Catholic husband to support her mission. Second, and most importantly, she needed to formally reconcile England with the Pope and eradicate the heresy that had, in her eyes, poisoned the realm for 2 decades. The old heresy laws from the 15th century were revived. These laws made it a capital crime to deny key Catholic doctrines. The punishment was death by fire. Mary saw this not as cruelty, but as a terrible necessity. A surgeon's knife to cut out the cancer before it consumed the soul of the nation. She believed she was saving her people from eternal damnation. The stage was set for the tragedy to begin. In February 1555, the first fire was lit. John Rogers, a biblical translator and Protestant cleric, was burned at the stake at Smithfield. He went to his death with courage, and the crowds watched in stunned, horrified silence. This was not the popular return to tradition Mary had envisioned, but for the Queen and her council, there was no turning back. The burnings accelerated. Over the next 3.5 years, nearly 300 people were executed. They were not, for the most part, powerful nobles. They were ordinary men and women weavers, blacksmiths, servants, priests, and even bishops. The most famous were the Oxford martyrs Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Cranmer himself, the very man who had annulled her mother's marriage. As Latimer and Ridley were being tied to the stake, Latimer famously cried out, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." His words were prophetic. Rather than terrifying the Protestants into submission, the burnings created a generation of martyrs. Their courage at the stake, recorded in detail by John Foxe in his hugely influential Book of Martyrs, became the founding story of English Protestantism. It turned public opinion irrevocably against the Queen and her Catholic faith, while the kingdom was choked with the smoke of the pyres. Mary was living through her own private agony. In the autumn of 1554, she announced the news the kingdom had been waiting for. She was pregnant. Her belly began to swell. She felt the baby move, and she ceased to menstruate. The court rejoiced. A Catholic heir would secure her legacy forever. Philip, who had been a cold and distant husband, might finally warm to her. God had blessed her mission. She went into confinement, awaiting the birth. The weeks turned into months. The due date came and went. Nothing. The physicians were baffled. Slowly, horrifically, the truth dawned upon the court, and then upon Mary herself. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. It was a phantom pregnancy, a condition known today as pseudocyesis, likely brought on by her overwhelming, desperate desire for a child. The public humiliation was devastating. Her body, like her kingdom, had failed her. Her enemies whispered it was a sign of God's displeasure. Her reign spiraled downwards. Philip, seeing no hope of an heir and no political advantage in staying, abandoned her and returned to Spain. To please him and draw him back, she had embroiled England in a disastrous war with France, which resulted in the humiliating loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent. The loss was a devastating blow to national pride. Mary herself was heartbroken, famously stating, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Incredibly, in 1557, aged 41, she convinced herself she was pregnant a second time. Once again, the symptoms appeared. Once again, the court held its breath, and once again, it was a delusion. This final, cruel trick of fate seemed to break her spirit. She was now a barren wife, a failed queen, her religious policy a bloody failure, her husband gone, her health shattered. She died in November 1558 sick, probably with influenza or uterine cancer, and utterly alone. Listening to the cheers from the streets as the people celebrated the accession of her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. Her life's work had been for nothing. The woman who had sacrificed everything for her faith died, knowing that the heretic sister she had spared would now inherit her throne and undo it all. Her tragedy was complete. If you were in her place, having endured all she had, watching the world you fought to build crumble into dust, what would your final thoughts be? Comment below. So we arrive at the central, agonizing question of Mary's reign. Why the fire? Why choose a method of execution so public, so excruciating, so designed to inspire terror to a modern mind? It is the act of a sadist, a psychopath. But to understand Mary, we must step out of our own time and into the terrifying, claustrophobic, faith-saturated mindset of the 16th century. The problem is not that Mary was uniquely cruel. The problem is that she was utterly, tragically, a product of her time and her trauma. Her actions were born from a collision of two powerful forces, her unshakable personal faith, forged in the fires of her own suffering, and the political and religious reality of the kingdom she inherited. The fundamental contradiction is this: Mary's goal was spiritual salvation, but her tool was physical destruction. She saw Protestantism not as a different opinion, but as a lethal poison of the soul. In her worldview, which was the standard Catholic worldview of the era, heresy was a spiritual pandemic. An individual heretic did not just endanger their own immortal soul. They were a contagion that could infect their family, their village, their entire nation, and condemn them all to an eternity of hellfire. Therefore, the state had a sacred duty, a divine obligation, to act as a physician of the soul. The burnings, in this terrifying logic, were not just a punishment. They were a form of extreme, public spiritual surgery. The fire was meant to purify the land, to create a terrifying spectacle that would scare the other members of the flock back to the safety of the one true church. And, in some theological views, even the fire itself offered the heretic one last chance to recant and save their soul at the moment of ultimate agony. It was a monstrous, twisted form of love. This presents us with the ultimate problem of power and piety. Mary ascended the throne not just as a monarch, but as a crusader. Her personal history had been defined by a single, unwavering belief that the Catholic faith was right, and the Protestant schism was a wicked crime against God and her mother. When she gained power, she saw no room for compromise. How could one compromise with damnation? How could one be tolerant of a creed that had branded her a bastard and shattered her world? Her personal trauma became her public policy. Her suffering validated her certainty. She believed God had tested her, like Job, and had placed her on the throne precisely to reverse the sins of her father and brother. The burnings were not, in her mind, an act of tyranny, but the ultimate act of obedience to God. The core problem is that this divine mission was diametrically opposed to the growing sense of English national identity and the changing religious landscape. She was trying to force a spiritual reality onto a political entity that was no longer willing to accept it. Her piety had made her blind. To truly dissect the tragedy of Mary Thausulkheim, we must look beyond the 16th century chronicle and apply the lenses of modern science, specifically psychology, biology, and sociology. These fields provide a framework for understanding not the what, but the why of her actions, transforming her from a one-dimensional villain into a case study of how personal trauma can shape history. From a psychological perspective, Mary is a classic example of what might now be diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. Unlike PTSD, which often stems from a single event, CPTSD arises from prolonged, repeated trauma, particularly during formative childhood and adolescent years. Consider her life from age 17 to 37, the public degradation, the label of bastard, the forced separation from her mother, the constant fear for her life, and the relentless pressure to renounce her core identity. This sustained period of trauma would likely have created a rigid, black and white worldview. For survivors of complex trauma, the world is often divided into safe and unsafe, good and evil, with little room for nuance. Compromise can feel like a threat to survival. Mary's stubborn adherence to Catholicism was not just piety, it was a psychological anchor in a world that had tried to destroy her. Her faith was the one thing they could not take from her. When she gained power, this psychological rigidity became state policy. The heretics were not just theological opponents. They were a living embodiment of the trauma and chaos that had shattered her youth. Eradicating them was on a deeply subconscious level, an attempt to eradicate the source of her own pain. Then there is the biological and medical tragedy of her phantom pregnancies. The condition, pseudocyesis, is a powerful psychosomatic phenomenon where the mind convinces the body it is pregnant. It is often triggered by an intense, overwhelming desire for a child. Combined with immense psychological stress, a perfect description of Mary's situation. As a queen, her primary duty was to produce an heir. As a devout Catholic, she believed a child would be God's ultimate vindication of her reign and her faith. This immense pressure created a feedback loop. Her desperate psychological need triggered physiological changes. Her abdomen swelled. She likely experienced hormonal shifts, that ceased her menstruation, and she may have even felt fetal quickening, which was, in reality, probably intestinal contractions. Imagine the profound mind-body connection required for this to happen. It speaks to an almost unimaginable depth of longing and desperation. The subsequent public humiliation, when no child appeared, would have been a catastrophic psychological blow. It would have amplified her feelings of failure and divine abandonment, perhaps even making her more desperate to prove her piety through other means, like a more fervent persecution of those she saw as God's enemies. Her empty womb may have fueled the fires of Smithfield. Finally, from a sociological perspective, Mary's actions can be understood through the lens of in-group, out-group dynamics and the sociology of religion. In the 16th century, religious identity was the primary marker of community. Your faith defined not just your afterlife, but your place in society. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the monolithic in-group of Western Christendom. Suddenly, there was a competing out-group living next door. Mary's policy was a violent, state-sponsored attempt to redraw and enforce the boundaries of the Catholic in-group. The burnings served a powerful social function. They were a ritual of purification and exclusion. By publicly and horrifically destroying the bodies of the out-group, the heretics, the regime sought to reinforce the identity and solidarity of the in-group, the faithful Catholics. This is a pattern seen throughout history, where a perceived threat from an out-group leads to persecution and violence as the in-group attempts to assert its dominance and define its boundaries. Mary was not just a queen. She was the leader of a threatened social tribe, using the ultimate tool of state power to try and eliminate the rival tribe. The tragedy, sociologically, is that this strategy almost always backfires. Persecution often strengthens the resolve of the outgroup, creates martyrs, and turns public sympathy against the persecutors, which is exactly what happened in Marian England. To truly grasp the gravity of Mary's reign, we must place it in a wider philosophical context. Her story is a chilling example of a timeless and terrifying archetype, the well-intentioned extremist. She is not an outlier in the grand, bloody tapestry of human history. Consider Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the French Revolution's reign of terror. Like Mary, he was a man of unshakable principle. Famously nicknamed the Incorruptible, he believed passionately in a republic of virtue, in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, in the name of preserving that virtue, he sent tens of thousands to the guillotine. He famously said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue." Swap virtue for true faith and guillotine for stake, and you can hear the echoes of Mary's own justification. Both believed they were purging society of a corrupting influence to create a better world. Both used the machinery of the state to commit mass murder in the name of a higher good. They force us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. At what point does passionate belief curdle into murderous fanaticism? Where is the line between a principled leader and a tyrant? This leads us to the philosophical dilemma of intent versus outcome. Can an action be considered good if its consequences are monstrous? Mary's intent, from her perspective, was benevolent. She was acting as a spiritual mother to her people, trying to save her children from the eternal fires of hell by exposing them to the temporary fires on earth. In her mind, the calculation was simple. The fleeting agony of the stake was an infinitesimal price to pay to avoid everlasting damnation. She was, in her own narrative, a savior. But the outcome was one of terror, division, and the creation of a legacy so bloody that it permanently damaged the Catholic cause in England? Does her good intention mitigate the horror of her actions, or does the sheer horror of the outcome render her intentions irrelevant? This is a fundamental question of moral philosophy. A consequentialist would argue that only the results matter. The burnings were evil because they caused immense suffering and failed to achieve their goal. A deontologist, however, might argue that the morality of an action is based on whether it adheres to a rule or duty. Mary believed she was following her sacred duty to God, a rule that superseded all human law and compassion. She was a tragic figure trapped in a moral framework where love and cruelty could occupy the same space. Ultimately, Mary's story forces us to confront the terrifying nature of certainty. Perhaps the greatest danger to humanity is not malice, but absolute, unshakable certainty in one's own righteousness. The moderate, the doubter. The person who entertains the possibility they might be wrong. They rarely build pyres. It is the true believer, the one who possesses a divine and infallible truth, who is capable of the greatest atrocities in the service of that truth. Mary's tragedy was not a lack of faith, but an excess of it, unseasoned by doubt or empathy. She could not see the human being in the heretic, because her vision was entirely consumed by the blinding light of her own divine mission. She serves as a historical warning against the seductive power of ideologies that claim to have all the answers. It compels us to ask ourselves, what are the absolute certainties we hold today, and what actions might we be willing to justify in their name? We invite you to share your thoughts. Is a good intention a valid defense for a horrific act? It is easy to dismiss the story of Bloody Mary as a relic of a barbaric past, a grim fairy tale from a distant, unenlightened age. We have science, human rights, and liberal democracy. We don't burn people for believing in the wrong God anymore. But to do so is to miss the point entirely. The specifics have changed, but the underlying human dynamics that fueled Mary's reign are frighteningly alive and well in the 21st century. The fire, the stake, the public square. These are merely the 16th century hardware for a software of intolerance, polarization, and ideological purity that is running on our own devices today. Mary's world of Catholic versus Protestant has been replaced by a sprawling battlefield of secular ideologies, left versus right, globalist versus nationalist, woke versus anti-woke. The public square of Smithfield has been digitized and scaled globally into social media platforms. While we may not burn heretics, we engage in digital rituals of public shaming, canceling, and deplatforming those who dissent from the prevailing orthodoxy of our particular in-group. The goal is the same: to purify the community, to enforce ideological conformity, and to make a terrifying example of the dissenter. The language of heresy has been replaced by accusations of bigotry, fascism, or treason, but the function is identical: to dehumanize the opponent and cast them out of the tribe of the righteous. Mary would have understood Twitter perfectly. Furthermore, Mary's tragedy is a powerful lesson on the interplay between a leader's personal trauma and their public governance. We continue to see how the unresolved psychological wounds of powerful individuals can ripple outwards, shaping policy and affecting millions of lives. A leader with a deep-seated sense of victimhood may govern with paranoia and aggression. A leader who has experienced profound instability may crave order and control at any cost. Mary's personal history of humiliation and persecution directly informed her political obsession with loyalty and her religious intolerance. It blinded her to political reality and made her incapable of the kind of pragmatic compromise that her sister Elizabeth would later master so brilliantly. When we select our leaders today, We often focus on their policies, their experience, and their charisma. But Mary's story reminds us that we should perhaps pay more attention to their character, their resilience, and how they have processed the inevitable traumas and disappointments of their own lives. A leader who has not made peace with their own ghosts will often unleash them upon their nation. Perhaps the most potent modern parallel is the danger of seeking simple answers in a complex world. Mary's England was a nation in flux. The old medieval certainties were collapsing under the weight of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and new economic pressures. It was a confusing, frightening time. Mary offered her people a simple, powerful solution, a return to the one true faith. All the confusion, all the division, could be solved by restoring the old order. This yearning for a simple narrative, a single cause that explains all our problems, and a single solution that will fix everything, is a powerful political force today. Whether it's blaming all of society's ills on immigrants, a political party, or a global conspiracy, the appeal of a simple, all-encompassing answer is immense. It relieves us of the difficult work of thinking critically, of holding multiple, contradictory ideas in our minds at once. Mary's reign is the ultimate cautionary tale about the catastrophic consequences of embracing a simple solution to a complex problem. The world is, and always has been, a messy, complicated place. Leaders who promise to purify it and make it simple are often the most dangerous of all. In the end, what are we left with when we look at Mary Tudor? We are left with a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a woman who desperately wanted to be loved by her father, by her husband, by her people, by her God, but who died unloved and reviled. We are left with a profound irony. Her violent, uncompromising effort to save Catholicism in England was the very thing that ensured its destruction. The smoke from the Smithfield fires choked the old faith and watered the seeds of a new, fiercely Protestant national identity. She intended to create martyrs for her faith, but instead created martyrs against it. She wanted to be the mother of a new Catholic dynasty, but instead, she became the dark prelude to the golden age of her Protestant sister. History is rarely kind, but to Mary, it has been uniquely cruel. It has flattened her, stripping away the traumatized daughter, the abandoned wife, the pious believer, and leaving only the two-word curse, Bloody Mary. But perhaps that is too simple. Perhaps her true legacy is not the fire, but the questions the fire forces us to ask. It forces us to look into the dark corners of faith, power, and human psychology. It makes us question our own certainties and the narratives we construct about heroes and villains. Was she a monster? If a monster is someone who inflicts terrible suffering, then yes. But if a monster is someone who acts without reason, without a recognizable human motive, then no. Her reasons were deeply, tragically human, a longing for order in a chaotic world, a desperate need to heal her own wounds by healing the wounds of her kingdom, and a profound, if misguided, love for God. She was not a monster. She was a casualty of history, a prisoner of her own piety. The story of Mary I is a reminder that the past is not a settled country. It is a contested territory, and our understanding of it changes as we change. We may never be able to fully absolve her, but we can strive to understand her. And in understanding her, we can perhaps better understand ourselves, our own capacity for belief, our own relationship with power, and the dark potential that lies within the quest for a perfect world. The final judgment on Mary Tudor may never be written, because her story is still playing out, every day, in the conflicts that define our own troubled times. What do you believe? Was Mary a tyrant driven by hate, a tragic victim of circumstance, or something far more complex and unsettling? Share your verdict in the comments below. And if you wish to continue unearthing the most fascinating and tragic hidden stories of the past, make sure you subscribe to The Hidden Past and ring the bell for notifications. The shadows are full of stories waiting to be told.